10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 415. Hey, everybody, welcome back to episode 415 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Today is part 2 of our series on the great Duke Ellington tune, Just Squeeze Me. Last week, we learned the melody together, and we learned about the key centers of this particular song. So if you are listening to this and you haven't checked out episode 414, please go and do that now because I would like you to learn the melody before we get into what we're going to talk about today. So, today we're actually going to talk about the bridge and we're going to get a little bit more specific with the chord changes in the bridge than just saying that it modulates to the key of concert B flat. There's some usefulness and utility in studying these changes and talking about a couple of things that we can highlight that will make your solos have more direction and give you a little bit more specificity. I always mess up that word, specificity, over the bridge. So it might seem kind of funny to leave the A sections wide open and talk about the bridge before we add anything to the A sections, but there's a really good reason for this. So if you are a Patreon member and you have access to the PDFs, please go and grab those now and have those in front of you, because we're going to start by looking at measure 17, which is where the B section starts. Now, what's cool about this bridge is that you are going to see it in dozens and dozens and dozens of tunes, this exact same bridge. So when we talk about the structure, I really want you to pay attention and make sure that you understand the structure of what we're talking about, because I'm telling you, if you think about like Fats Waller, his music, he loves to use this bridge, and there's lots of other composers that really utilize this setup, this chord progression, this modulation in the B sections of their tunes. So it's a lot more important than just this tune. And again, if you can understand that structure, you're going to be good. Okay? All right. So we know that we are in the key of concert F major for the A sections of this tune. So let's get that sonority into our heads, into our ears. And then what happens is when we get to measure 17, all of a sudden that F major sound, now we introduce the flat 7. So if you could hear this note moving to this note, that's the really, really important part. So now we have a concert F7 chord. Well, we know that most of the time when we're using a dominant chord, or I shouldn't say most of the time, I should say a lot of the time, especially when we see the 1 chord become a dominant chord, one with a flat 7, a 7 chord, what it tells us is that we're about to move somewhere else, right? So typically, when that 1 chord becomes dominant, it's a signal that we're modulating to the key of the 4. And all of a sudden, this chord, if you're doing a Roman numeral analysis, goes from being the Roman numeral 1 to being the Roman numeral 5 of 4. And it's telling us something's coming. We're about to go somewhere else. And then lo and behold, 2 measures later, we see it go somewhere else. We see it go to the 4. And obviously that F7 chord is the dominant of B flat, so it leads us beautifully into B flat. Okay? So we're chilling out in the key of F major. B comes around and we hear this. It's such a nice modulation. And we hear it in the melody as well. So we hear bum, 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 ba, da, ba, da. Ba-ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, ba-ba-da-da-da-da-da-da, ba-ba-da-da-da-da-ba-do-da. Okay, so it really obviously it fits the melody, but that's the chord movement that's going on underneath it. Okay, so then we chill out on that B flat major for 2 bars, and then we see it move down to a concert G7. So what the heck is that concert G7? Because it doesn't fit in the key of B flat, and it also doesn't fit in the key of F, right? Because we've got a B natural. So what is it? Well, this is what we call another secondary dominant. And if we think in the key of F, because we're going back to the key of F, the point of the second half of the bridge is to lead us back to the key of F major. All right. So if we think about the 5 chord in F major, we have C7, concert C7. Now, if we think about the way that G7 relates to C, we realize that that G7 is what we call a 5 of 5. So if we're in the key of C, we go up to the 5th step, we get G, and we have a G7 chord. So we're leading ourselves to the 5 of F by playing this 5 of C. I hope that makes sense. This is a really, really important thing that happens in a ton of tunes. You have to understand what these secondary dominants are. Another term that's really often used is called borrowed dominants. So in essence, we're borrowing the dominant from the key of C to lead us to a C chord, but then that C chord is going to be a C7 chord, and that's going to lead us back to F. So I hope that makes sense. A little bit of theory for you. So now we have G7 for 2 bars. And then instead of going directly to C7, instead what we see is that G7 chord turn into a G minor 7. And of course, the G minor 7 is the 2 in the key of F. So then we get a 2, 5, and then we're back to the key of F. All right. Now, there's one other thing that I want to talk about. This motion of B flat major down to G7 is super important because if you think about this chord G7, it's what we would call a pivot chord. All right. If we're in the key of B flat and we go down to a G7 chord, it's the 5 of 2, right? So what we could do in the key of B flat, and what we hear all the time is we hear B flat major to G7 to C minor 7 to F7 back to B flat. In jazz shorthand, we would call that 1, 6, 2, 5, 1. But really, we can't call that G7 chord 6 because it has a B natural in it. So we would call it 5 of 2. It's the secondary dominant G7 that would be moving to a C minor 7 chord. But in this case, what we're doing is we are hearing it actually function to get us back to the key of F, all right? So if you're confused, rewind that and listen to the whole thing when I explain it, because this is crucial. But this chord movement is one of the most common in all of jazz history. And there's a thing that most bass players will do. The bass line is almost written itself. So if we're in the key of B flat and we want to go down to G, very, very often we'll hear the bass player do this. So let me put that in context. Let's go back to the beginning of the bridge. So we got F7 to B flat. Now listen to the bass line. So I haven't told you what that bass line is, but I would suggest that you figure it out. Okay? But this is how the bridge works. So no longer are we just saying, okay, we modulate to the key of B flat, and then we go back to the key of F. Now we know that there's some actual harmonic motion in there. And what we can do this week is we can practice outlining that harmonic motion over the bridge. Let's just hear it one more time. So we're in the key of F major. Here we go, F7. Okay. And again, like I said, that series of chords, that harmonic motion is extremely important. So I really want you to be able to wrap your ears around that. Maybe sit down at the piano and play that chord progression yourself. Try to figure out that bass line. And then as far as soloing goes, what I really want you to focus on is making sure, or not making sure, but it might be wise to highlight that concert E moving to E flat. You might want to outline that in your melodic line. And then obviously that voice leads to D. That would be what I would think about if you're looking for some direction. See if you can, in your solo, reflect the fact that the major chord is turning into a dominant chord, and then we're modulating to the key of B flat. All right. So I am going to give the Patreon members the new lead sheet so that you could see those chords on paper. And then the $5 members will also get another trading track where you can actually practice that bridge with the actual changes. Okay. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, the way that we keep this podcast going, it is a listener supported show. So we use the Patreon platform and a small monthly donation to make sure that this thing keeps going and that I can keep putting it out. If you want to join up, see the types of rewards you get, all the materials that you get, head over to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or simply go to patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson. You can find out about all that stuff, and you can get instant access to the materials from this episode and every single other episode that we have ever put out. So it's a pretty good deal. Might be one of the best deals in jazz education. Shout out to some new patrons this week. Thank you to Stefan, Ben, Brian, Brad, Peter, Stephanie, Martin, and Jerry. Thank you so much for joining up to become a part of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson family. Of course, to everybody over there that's signed up and supporting us, thanks. We couldn't do this without you. It really keeps us going over all these years, which has been great. So again, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson podcast. All right, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week with another episode. Bye, everybody.